focused on self-promotion and seems to be becoming more focused on living a self-centered life. The whole thing is about living a God-centered life, but the world is about living a self-centered life. First and foremost, we're not surprised that that would be the strategy. Because if I'm self-focused, I can't be God-focused. But how do we live in that? And so I was actually, just through the week, I saw one of our guys that was actually up in Rotorua, Daniel Hauroa Club, and he had put up a couple of thoughts from the message that Pastor Mua had preached last week. And it was just on the life of Daniel. And there were a few key bits of language in there that I was like, man, that just is resonating with me. I think we need that in Macedon. So I was like, bro, send me your notes, because I'm about to like fully leverage your hustle in order to be able to bless my community. So that's why I've got this, is because there are some key phrasings and some key language that he's put together that I think is going to bless us this morning. Is that all right? So that's like the peer behind the curtain. That's why I've got this morning. We're driving with that. So we're talking about the life of Daniel, and the life of Daniel is incredible. We know lots and lots of stories of miracles, and he's at the interpretation of dreams, and there's like a finger that appears and starts drawing some stuff on the wall. But we can't have Daniel chapters 2, 3, 4, and so on without Daniel chapter 1. And so we're going to start in Daniel chapter 1 this morning. I don't know what the chapter that you are in right now looks like. I don't know what your chapter is right now, whatever it is that we're up to. But how you respond in this chapter is going to determine and position as to how you can walk into the chapters that are yet to be written. And so we're going to look at some of Daniel's response. So in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 3, we read this. Then the king, which is Nebuchadnezzar, ordered Ashpenaz, someone say Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. So that brief history of nearly everything is that the nation of Israel had chance to be obedient to the Lord's word. They had neglected and worshipped other gods and done all of this stuff. After 490 years, God's like, you know what? Let's just have a wee break. And so the Babylonian Empire comes in, and it takes the people of Israel into exile. So they're living as captives in a strange land. You may have heard, by the rivers of Babylon, where we said, yeah, we wept when we remembered Zion. Because we wept because we're not there anymore. We're sat by the rivers of Babylon, and we're believing for our promised land. And so this is the context for it. So King Nebuchadnezzar, when we're saying the king, someone say Nebuchadnezzar. It's actually probably more something like Nabu-Kadzat-Ure, but that's okay. We'll call him Nebuchadnezzar just for the sake of this morning. He was Nebuchadnezzar the second. His dad wasn't the first. I don't know who the first was, but it wasn't his dad. He was the founder of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. It's the Babylonian Empire that we see that takes Judah into exile. There's lots and lots of things about his life that have been written down. And in fact, he built a whole bunch of stuff throughout Babylon, and his name was written on every single brick. Right? So classic, we'll call that textbook narcissism, because everyone seems to throw narcissism around today. But unless you are writing your name on every single brick that you're building with, you've got a way to go before catching up to Nebuchadnezzar. But see, what happens is the reason that we would put our name on everything is because that's the way that I can be remembered. See, my name will survive after me because this temple, this wall, this building, it will far outweigh me. And it got me thinking, like, I was actually just talking recently with someone that reminded me of I went to, in Dunedin, I went to a place called Hayward Hall, or Hayward College. And so that was a place that I would stay. And so it had obviously had its name inscribed on it by this dude called Hayward. But I say this dude called Hayward because I have no idea who he was. I have no idea what he accomplished. I lived there for an entire year. And although his name was plastered on the building, and so there's this thing, it's like, it's not just enough, like, we know people put their names on stuff. I've got to be remembered. This was opened by so-and-so and so. This is whatever the center is. And there's something in the life of even Nebuchadnezzar that gives us a little bit of clue as to why. See, he was an evil king. He was the longest reigning king at this time. And he became aware that his time was limited. He was aware that his time was limited, as probably every king and ruler has ever done. And so what he did was he orientated his whole being into extending that reign, extending the duration of his power, and just really solidifying that as much as he could, because he wanted to keep himself there for as long as possible. And what he knew was that they've just taken this nation into exile, right? They've taken, and the way that they did that was by defeating them militarily. So the army goes, and it probably a few people got, and then they take them into exile. But he knows, and he's actually quite clever in this, it's not just enough to subdue a people with military power. Because eventually, over time, they will grow strong enough again, and they will keep resisting and keep resisting and keep resisting until the point where they're actually able to either escape or flee or overthrow, because that's what happens, right? Partly he gets a bit of that from Egypt. He knows if I leave these people and let them have their way, if I give them enough time, eventually I might become the 10 plagues of Babylon. I don't know, something to that effect. So he has a plan. He has a plan. And so the plan, we read it in this verse, the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of the staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families that had been brought to Babylon as captives. He goes after the cream of the crop of the next generation, right? And his plan is that he brings them into his house, into his palace. He takes the cream of the crop, and what he does, he creates essentially, just for context, he creates his own university, and he trains these cream of the crop Jewish next generation people to think and to live like a Babylonian. Because they'd spent their whole life being taught how to live and to think like a Jew. And so rather than live like a Jew under my sword, I'm going to teach you how to live and how to think like a Babylonian. So that's his strategy. And it seems to be that is the strategy that continues today. It seems to be that is the strategy that continues today. The enemy always goes after the next generation. The enemy always knows that if I can get hold of the cream of the crop of the next generation, and if I can train them to think like I do, if I can train them to speak like I do, with words dripping with lies and deceit and all of this, I can get them. And part of it is because even our opposition knows that his time is limited. His time is limited, and so it's about trying to extend and to do as much damage on the way. So if you can remember, the plan is to take the next generation and cause them to think and to live like a Babylonian. That's what the King Nebuchadnezzar's grand plan is. Now, a plan without tactics just stays on paper. So let's look at some of the tactics of King Nebuchadnezzar. Number one, someone say isolation. Isolation. What does he do? He takes them out of their land, first of all, right? So that's kind of the whole country gets isolated from that. But then he takes the sons of the royal family, the sons of the noble families, and he brings them in and he isolates them even further. So he separates them from any sort of worship. Because the Jews would have continued on with some of their worship through those times. He separates them from that. He separates them from the teaching of the Word of God. He separates them from fellowshipping with the people of God. Just the day-to-day of living life, getting wisdom from your elders that have gone before you. He isolates and he separates them from that. Just as a little bit of an FYI, one of the primary things that the enemy does to separate us from the purposes of God is he attempts to separate us from the people of God, right? And there can be a raft of different reasons as to why someone ends up separated from the people of God. But I've seen this time and time again. I'm sure Jonathan would say the same thing. Someone that's separated from the people of God long enough end up almost 100% of the time separated from the purposes of God. Now here's the thing, I'm sure were the Jewish elders perfect? Probably not. Was every single interpersonal relationship amazing? Probably not. That's, this is the whole thing. But the enemy's going after this, and I want to make someone aware and just be reminded. Even it might be yourself just tempted to be separated from the people of God. Maybe there's someone in your world that you know that is just separated and isolated. And it's like, man, the purposes of God over your life are incredible, but there's just something that's not going on right now. There's this isolation. The isolation comes through a whole bunch of different lies. The isolation comes through a bunch of stinking thinking. Oh, they don't really like me, or I'm not really like them. I'm a little bit weird. They're a little bit weird. Like there's all of this type of stuff that goes on, but it's just a bit of a heads up. That's why. And so what Daniel does is he kind of hustles a bit of an e-group together. Right? He hustles this bit of an e-group. That we see some of the names, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and he's like, look, we need to stand together. I can't do this by myself. And so they make a bit of a pact, right? They make a bit of a pact. They have a few squad goals. In verse 12 of chapter 1, Daniel says, please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, right? I wonder whether, what's his name? Mishael might have been like, oh, really? Just vegetables and water? Mishael might be like, oh, man, I was kind of enjoying a few steaks and whatever. But, okay, when the boys are in it together, like, how many know doing things together? When we lean in on these types I love Daniel Fast. I've been so grateful to hear this year just a wider group of people leaning in and connecting around this together, because it just reminds me that we can't do this on our own. And so there are definitely some tactics when it comes to isolation. One of those things can be devices. This old thing. Wonderful piece of technology that it is. Incredible, but it gives us a sense of escapism. Right? I can get out of the real world by being in virtual reality. And, it's like that classic Instagram thing of we see everyone's highlight reels. And we see everyone's like, oh man, everyone's like, the whole world must be so rich. Because it seems like the whole world's on holiday all the time. It's just like, nah, there's just a few people that are on holiday, but I can see it all the time. But we get that sense of like, oh man, everyone is just in the Greek islands of Mykonos, like all the time. Why is everyone just on yachts and boats? Why am I not on a boat right now? I'd like to be on a boat on the Mediterranean Sea. Hey, maybe that's us next year. Come for a visit to Sicily. Yeah, my guy. All right, if anyone needs a good bed and breakfast chain and you're in Sicily, Joshua's your guy to hit up. It's good. But our devices can draw us away. It's escapism and man, the mental health correlations, because everyone's life is airbrushed to heck. No one actually looks like they do on their Instagram, because it's all just filters. Like, you see them in real life, it's like, there's false advertising, right? We used to have standards against false advertising. But anyway, I think I've made that point enough. I don't need to harp on that. We kind of get that one. What I'm saying is this is a wonderful tool, but it can be used by the enemy to isolate you, to distract you, and to cause you to want to escape your reality. Actually, and none of these things are bad things, right? You'll even hear this. The second one is work. He can use our work to distract us. He can use our work to isolate us. And there's this question like, how is our work connected to the purposes of God? And it's not like, what I don't mean by that is everybody the pastor of a church, because that's ridiculous. We've moved past that, eh? Here at Equippers Church, we know we're all ministers. I got a particular role, but you got particular roles. You got ministry that you need to do. And so if you can answer in your head the question of how is what am I doing connecting to the purposes of God, right? Just make sure that, and I want to encourage, maybe even over this Christmas period, what's the orientation of my life? What am I doing day in and day out? And is it connected to the purposes of God? Because here's the thing, He needs you to connect to the purposes of God as a teacher, as a mum, as an electrician, as a painter, as a whatever it is. He needs you to connect to the purposes of God as a social worker. He needs you to connect to the purposes of God, whatever it is that you're doing. He needs you to connect to the purposes of God in your retirement. He needs you to connect to your purposes of God on your summer holidays while you're a student. He needs us connected to the purposes. But here's the thing. He doesn't actually need us to be connected to His purposes. We need to make sure that we are connected to the purposes of God, because otherwise I'm at the risk of being isolated. If my work is not connected to the purposes of God, then the work eventually separates me from his purposes. So devices aren't bad, work's not bad, but we just got to make sure. The next one, and it's actually a relatively new phenomenon. You may have heard of the nuclear family, right? Mum, dad, and 2.4 kids. It's actually a relatively new phenomenon, and it's actually not a particularly Christian idea. It's a Western idea, but the idea of the nuclear family actually gets used to isolate people. Right? And in fact, there's this idea that if I can take, let's say there's mum and dad and 3 kids, if I can kind of separate that family into 3 more nuclear families, what I can now do is generate 3 more mortgages. I can generate 3 more lots of utilities bills. I can generate 3 households worth of all of these expenses. And then if I can replicate that time and time again, they're going to each have to work at jobs that they hate in order to be able to maintain that disconnected reality. And just over time, there's this, where there is something so rich to the idea of like village life, having the village, the connection. Who am I drawing on? That shared network. And so our nuclear family, it's like, we're just taking a break from church to focus on our family. It's, like I say, this is why it's not a Christian idea, is because you may have heard the saying, blood is thicker than water, right? So we think it's like, just me and my family. No. The original saying, the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. That's what the saying was actually meant to be, which is to say, when Christ, his blood has united us in covenant relationship, that is a more significant and meaningful connection than having shared a womb together. That's crazy talk, right? If I say something, you're like, oh, you're trying to break down the family. No, I'm not trying to break down the family unit. I'm trying to make sure that we know that we're connected to a family unit that will survive through the age that is to come. That is my family. I don't want to be isolated from that. Church is designed to be your family. We've got to learn to integrate our family into the wider family. I love what my kids get to experience, and they're here and they're having to connect with different kids across different spheres of life, but there's that learning how to grow together in love. I love that our kids can be here and see how to work through conflict. They can see how to communicate when we aren't getting on. See, if that's just in my family, things can just blow up because we don't have that full experience. So is that all right? I'm not saying devices are bad. I'm not saying work's bad. I'm not saying that mum, dad, and 2.4 kids is bad. What I'm saying is that these things can be used by the enemy to isolate us from the people of God. So isolation, we got that? Number 2, indoctrination. Indoctrination. What's indoctrination? Thanks for asking. It's the process of teaching a person or a group of people to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. Right? The process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. Now, every ideology on the planet needs to indoctrinate people because otherwise they won't buy into it. As soon as you start thinking critically about any ideology, now here, the full spectrum, whether it's capitalism, socialism, it doesn't matter. When I think about it to the full experience, it falls over. So I have to get people to think about it uncritically. One of the things that I love about the Church of Jesus Christ is that when you are genuinely equipped with the tools and the understanding to consider the whole of this created earth critically, the answer I find is that Jesus Christ always comes to the surface. I love being able to sit with my kids and as they're growing, just having increasingly like complex and colorful conversations. But I also love that I never have to feel like this is what you have to think. I love that every other ideology on the planet, every other way to live has to be embrace this without question. Don't you question this, right? And I would say that, just for the sake of not getting off the hook entirely, an overly misunderstood Christianity, a weak faith, has to force people to believe things about the Bible as well. But I love that the gospel of Jesus Christ is so rich and eternal and full of life that as I take kids on a journey of knowing stories and thinking about where did I come from? Do you know that when a 6-year-old asks you, where did I come from, they are not interested in a sperm and an ovum coming together and the breaking in and then the multiplication of cells and then the delivery through, that whole setup. That's not what they're asking. When a child asks you, where did I come from, they have just become aware of the fact that they once weren't. That's what a kid is asking when they say, where did I come from? And I love that there's this idea, my consciousness has a starting point. So what was I before that? Where did I come from? What's this whole thing about? And I can say, look, man, God has a plan and a purpose. You were knitted together in your mother's womb. God saw you before you were, and you are because he imagined Ezekiel Cornford. He saw. And this is why you are here. And that's why I can look at you and the image of God is implanted on this kid. So as I can go through life, I rest so easy in the fact I don't have to tell my kids what they have to believe. I just tell them what I understand to be true from the scriptures. And it just seems to be like time and time again, it makes sense, buddy? She's like, oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's good. But so, indoctrination. In verse 4, Ashpenaz was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. So this is a real clever strategy. Literature and language. Stories and speech. If I want to get to someone, the greatest thing I can do is give them the stories that I want them to read. And the greatest thing I can do if I want to learn to control them is to change their language. Now, when it comes to the stories, the Babylonian Empire, they've got a creation story, just like the Jews have a creation story. And in the Babylonian creation story, Marduk takes the giant dragon of the sky, Tiamat, and dismembers her entirely, and the drops of her blood form people. So that's the story, right? That's what we're talking about literature. They're not saying like the Babylonians had a Shakespeare. It's not like they're like, hey, read the Babylonian Shakespeare. It's like, no, here's the stories of how we came to be. Because if my origin story is about military conquest and things being torn apart, then I have every justification under the sun as an empire to go into the world, rip things apart, and see, that's what we're talking about. I change the stories. Whereas if my story is that God just simply spoke and things came into being and it was all giving up its fruit and I was called to tend and develop and there was peace, and if that's my origin story, it makes going into another country and stabbing someone really hard, right? If my origin story is one of peace and creation and life, shalom, like the fullness of rest, if that's my origin story, so it's really important. But equally, like I was just having a conversation this week, and you may have heard of these words, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like that's a pretty common thing at the moment. Now, how many know diversity sounds really good? Equity sounds really good. Inclusion sounds really good. But if I can take those three words and I can change their meaning, then I can make something that sounds really good actually embody just a yuck at the bottom of it. The words change over time. What's another example? Might be charity. When I say charity, you think like maybe sympathy. Doing something like for, it's those charities, they like look after people that can't look after themselves. Like charity is the highest Christian virtue. It's self-sacrificial love for another. But we say, oh, I don't need your charity. What? That's pride speaking, right? So no, I desperately need your charity. I need your self-sacrificial love, just like you need my self-sacrificial love. But if I can change the words that someone is speaking, I can change their whole destiny. Because when it comes down to it, the stories that my life is based on and the language that I use frames up my worldview. It frames. Now here's the thing. The godless view the world differently than the godly. Is that a fair enough statement? The godless view the world. See, if I do not have the bigness of God's redemptive work in place, of course I'm just going to get what I can from this work. I got to get mine. Got to get that bread. Of course I'm going to live like that when the world seems to be full of finite resources. I see the world differently. And so Nebuchadnezzar was like, if I can take the cream of the crop, the best and the brightest, the next generation, and give them my worldview, and they can embrace that, man, this is going to be good for us. Romans 12, 1-2. This is kind of the antidote to indoctrination. And this is actually out of the Message, because I think this reads really nicely. So here's what I want you to do. With God helping you, take your everyday, ordinary life. You're sleeping, you're eating, you're going to work, you're walking around life. Place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing that you can do for Him. How cool is that? What can I do for God? Embrace what He's done for you. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. What is that? That's indoctrination. Don't be indoctrinated to your culture. Instead, fix your attention on God and you'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity. God brings out the best of you and He develops well-formed maturity in you. See, the world is trying to draw you down to its level of immaturity, of childish thinking, childish action, childish behavior. Now, let's not do that. Let's let God bring out the best. But if I just isolate and indoctrinate and then keep someone in prison in horrible conditions, right? Eventually, my hold on them will slip. Okay? Eventually, they will rebel even though I have isolated and indoctrinated. So the next thing that Nebuchadnezzar puts in place is compromise. Someone say compromise. Compromise. Daniel 1:5. Check this out. The king assigned to them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. A daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they enter the king's service. So can you imagine 3 years of isolation, so you haven't heard any of the God stories, 3 years of different literature and different language, and then not only that, for 3 years, you got to eat from the table of the most powerful empire on the planet at that time. Talk about living in the lap of luxury. 3 years of that would be pretty hard to rebel against it, right? Would that be fair? Because when you think about the king's table, it's not just some sort of food and some sort of wine. This is the best of the land. And they've been assigned some of the best. And so where compromise comes in is to go, hey, in order to maintain the isolation and the indoctrination, to keep you calm, to keep you happy, I'm just going a sense of compromise. Why don't you eat this good stuff? Partake of this. How good is this? Somebody in Nebuchadnezzar's palace, he probably had a bunch of advisors, but they knew enough about the human heart to see that most men have their price. Most men have their price. That good times, comfort, self-esteem, and a strong position in society are usually a sufficient bid for the soul. If I'm contending for your soul, I want to bring you good times and comfort, and I want to make you feel good about yourself, and I want to give you a position in society. Because everyone wants to belong, right? No one wants to be an outcast. No one wants to be rejected. No one wants to be known as Daniel the exile. No. Give me those things. You may have heard this truism. The way to a man's heart is through his. Thank you. Someone in Nebuchadnezzar's palace knew that. And they hustled for 3 years to get to the heart of the young men. At least that was their plan. That was their strategy. So food and wine from the king's table. What does Daniel ask for? Marjorie. Marjorie knows. Marjorie knows. Why is that a thing? When we talk about Daniel fast, when we talk about fast, why does that matter? Because the comfort and the good things of life can be so quick and easy to draw us away from the purposes of God. And he asks something of me. He asks me to speak a word or to speak truth to power, but I want to keep my job. I want to make sure my paycheck is secure. If people know that I'm a Christian, they might start to distance themselves from me. I may lose my place of privilege in my society. I may start feeling like an outcast. Friends, let's just rip the Band-Aid off. The way of following Jesus is the way of the exile. When Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, it is the way of separation from the things of the world. We rip that Band-Aid off. It's been speaking to me, and I've just become increasingly aware, and it can become obvious, but when the time lands, one of the greatest oppositions to living a God-centered life is a comfort-centered life. And so even over these last 21 days, I've been having to ask myself really strongly, come on, where are you comfortable? Where are you clinging to comfort rather than clinging to the purposes of God? Compromise means that we accept, that we reduce the demands, we change our opinion in order to reach an agreement with someone or something else. Oh, well, hell's not really eternal. How could a loving God send people to hell? No, I'm not going to compromise on what Jesus himself was so clear about. If you're not in me, eternal separation from the Father. I can't compromise that. Anyway, you get the idea. Let's not live a life of compromise. Do you really need to go to church this morning? No, I know you're all here, so you kind of passed that test today. But I'm aware that it's always there. You've been the last couple of weeks. Just chill out. Well, that could have been the morning that God wanted to move through you to set someone free of addiction. That could have been the morning that God wanted to move. For what? Maybe you were at home watching infomercials. Yeah, okay, it was comfortable, but what if? Now, I'm not saying that I have to come to church every Sunday for God to achieve his purposes, right? But what I am saying is that how often do we compromise? Oh, do you really need to give? Isn't that tithing thing? That's Old Testament. That's law stuff. I'm actually under grace. I don't know if you know this, but I'm under grace. Do you know what grace is? Divine action. The only reason I can give is because of grace, because God's action in my life. Do you know the only reason that time and time again my life seems to work out financially is because I'm under grace? But in order to stay under grace, I make sure that I discipline myself. I make sure that I don't compromise on the word of God. Do you really? You really? You don't need to go to E-group tonight. They probably, this would be a bit annoying. And do you even need to go to E-group? Do you really have time to do that thing that God's asking? No, you're right. Just chill out. You don't have time. Right? This stuff can creep in, right? And I'm not speaking to any, these are just some ideas. I'm not speaking to any particular thing. I'm just saying that how often do we change our opinion on something in order to maintain a comfortable relationship with the things of the world? That's why fasting is so important. Fasting is so important. And I've just, this for me, I know that overeating for me leads to overindulgence in other things, right? This is one of those ones. Overindulgence is the symptom, the cause. It leads to a self-centered life. And, in terms of those moments of vulnerability, I've had about 4 years where I just didn't consider what I was eating. Didn't even think about it. Why? Because there was a 4-month period of time where I couldn't eat anything at all. If I did, I couldn't even swallow my own saliva for 10 days because everything was just ripped from the inside out. So I stopped thinking about it. I stopped concerned with, it's all good, I just have that, I just eat whatever I like. But I know that this is the moment where the Lord's like, hey, that's 4 years ago. That traumatic thing, that's 4 years ago. Like, is your comfort now because of that thing that happened 4 years ago? Do you want to stay holding on to that? Are you sure? You really? If I can stop something at its root, which for me sometimes is food, I can stop it going on and I can stop the ongoing effects in other areas of my life. Right? This is just me. I don't put that on anyone else. What I know is that fasting denies our flesh and it requires self-control. Particularly when our kids still eat what they have been eating. Let's have some ice cream for afternoon tea. Dad, do you want some ice cream? No. Kinda. No. But here's the thing. I have sometimes tried to self-control myself, which makes sense. I've tried to self-control myself. And what I've come to find out is that self-control is not the fruit of Matt Cornford. Self-control is a fruit of the Holy Spirit. And so one of the things that's amazing about fasting, and even just through this time, is that I'm aware of the amount to which myself can dominate. It becomes highlighted, it becomes obvious, but I need to be prepared to put that thing to rest. And like I say, he didn't talk to me about that last year. Didn't talk to me about that the year before. He might not be talking that to you now. But what I'm saying is that when the moment comes, are we prepared to move away from the things that are keeping? Now, for me, it's food. For someone else, there can be all sorts of things. Out in my garage, doing my tinkering. On my screen, jamming my PlayStation. It can be Netflix. Comfort comes in all of these different ways for all sorts of different people. And so I just want to ask someone, are we compromising in these areas? And then finally, we'll talk about confusion. I'll do this one nice and quickly. So we have those 4 names, right? Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But that's not what we call them in Babylon. You may know 3 of them slightly differently. Daniel, we kind of know Daniel because he is, that's the book Daniel. If it was called the book of Belteshazzar, we might know him as Belteshazzar, but that's what he was called when he was in captivity. But what were our other 3 friends called? Anyone want to take a wild stab? Oh, look at that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That wasn't their names. That's what we call them. Why? Because the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, changed their name. Why? Because if I start being like, hey, Paul, thank you. Hey, Paul, how you doing? He didn't respond for ages. How you doing, Paul? You good? Right? He's been called Matt for a long time. So I might have to call him Paul for a long time before I can indoctrinate him to start seeing himself as Paul. See, the enemy, if he can convince you that you have a different name, if he can call you by a different name for long enough, victim, anxious, poor, without hope, if I can call you that for long enough, what do you start to do? You start to respond to that name. You give it long enough, you start to respond to that name. To hear a different name day after day after day would have caused confusion. Just like Matt was confused when he looked up when I called him Paul. Of course he's confused. What's this going on about? But it gives them another reason to give in to the Babylonian way of thinking. If God can convince you of a different name. See, if the enemy can confuse your identity, then you know for sure he can rob you of your destiny. Because if you know the name that God has spoken over you, you know that that individual has a plan, a purpose, and a destiny that's been written in the stars, in the fabric, in the foundation of time. The King of Kings, the creator of the universe, wrote a special script for Justine. But if I can start calling her for long enough, she moves away from the purpose. She moves away from the destiny. And she starts to believe, no, I'm not enough. No, you're right, I can't speak very well. I'm a bit confused. No, you're right, I'm not. You know, right, you got your thing. You all got your thing. We've got a whole lot of people walking this earth that don't know who they are because they don't know whose they are. Our identity is not wrapped up in our career. Our identity is not wrapped up in our gender. Our identity is not wrapped up in our sexual preferences. God forbid, imagine if that was the primary thing that you orientated your life around. How weird would that, right? You get the idea. Why does the enemy come after identity time and time and time again? Because he knows that your identity is that you were created in the image of God. You were created with a plan, a purpose, a destiny. Your identity is found in the one that created you. You were created to be a son of the Most High God. You were created to be known as a daughter of the King. I love when, Who Loves the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? And they what is it, Care Paravel, and they turn up, and Aslan refers to them as son of Adam, daughter of Eve. Like destiny is restored in that moment. Why does it matter that I was a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve? Because there's a royal bloodline. Why does it matter that you are a son of the Most High God or a daughter of the Most High God? Because you have a royal bloodline. Not by right, but by adoption in the work of Jesus Christ. He alone can lay hold of the bloodline of King. But I've been adopted, I've been grafted in to that purpose and to that destiny. And friends, I want to tell someone today, that is your destiny. The method and pattern that Nebuchadnezzar used to draw Daniel away from God, or at least attempt to, is the same method that's used today. Isolation from God's influence. Isolation from His word, His presence, and His people. Indoctrination with worldly ways of thinking. Compromise with the riches and comforts of this world. And confusion around our identity and purpose in life. And so I want to ask someone again, how do you remain faithful? How do you remain faithful in a world that's more and more anti-God? How do you remain faithful in a world that's more about self-promotion, more about the comfort life? Well, there's just two words. I need to make a decision whether I choose to be defiled or if I'm going to be sanctified. I need to make a decision. Am I going to live profane? Am I going to live like common purpose? Am I going to live defiled? Or am I going to live sanctified, set apart, made holy? What's holy? Not morally blameless. Holy is set apart for a special purpose. Do you want to live plain, or do you want to live with a special purpose? Even if you are a jar of clay, inside of you is a divine treasure that is beyond imagination. Defiled or sanctified. And so when I ask the question, how do I resist the things of the world? Friends, your willpower is about as limited as mine. At 10 o'clock at night when Justine's ginger slice is in the cupboard. And I haven't dealt with some things. It's just a little bit of vulnerability, take it for what it's worth. You got your things, I know. It's okay. That's limited. But you know what's not limited? The Holy Spirit. Do you know what sanctifies you? Not your good works. Oh man, that sounds a little bit like gospel to me. You're not sanctified, you're not set apart, you're not made holy by the things that you can do, but by the Spirit that was poured out through the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross. And I'm calling someone else to join me today to pick the area of defilement in your life and allow the Holy Spirit, even now, come on, stand to your feet. Allow the Holy Spirit to set you apart. You know what the thing is. I don't want to identify it for you. The lie that you've believed, the name that you've been answering to for far too long, when your name is not that. Your name is child of God. Your name is daughter of the King. Come on, let's respond to a different name this morning. I love 1 Peter 1:2. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the elect exiles. Come on, we are exiles. We are exiles, the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and that one. According to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ, for the sprinkling with His blood. Do you know that the blood of the spotless sacrifice was never sprinkled on something to make it holy? To get rid of its sin. It was sprinkled on it to make it holy. The blood was sprinkled on a plain thing to make it set apart for special purpose. Your sin was put on the back of a goat and taken outside of the camp. It was removed outside.